Title: Fractured Existence. Chapter 1: The First Omission. Tom's life had always been comfortably predictable. A quiet office job, a small apartment with few personal touches, a handful of acquaintances, and the same daily routine. He had even grown accustomed to his solitary evening walks, using them as a way to unwind after the demands of work. One evening, as dusk settled into night, Tom decided to take a shortcut through a forested path he'd heard about from a co-worker. The path was supposed to be quicker and scenic, a rare bit of nature among the city streets. He was tired, and the thought of shaving off a few minutes was enticing. But as he stepped onto the trail, he was struck by an eerie feeling, a strange prickle at the base of his neck, as though the shadows around him were alive, shifting silently in the night. Tom shrugged off the feeling, chalking it up to exhaustion, and continued walking. The air felt colder, thick with a dampness that clung to his skin. He told himself to relax, to enjoy the quiet of the night, but his body felt tense, his pulse quickening as if he were being watched. Every few steps, he would glance over his shoulder, catching glimpses of movement in the dark, only to find nothing but trees and shadows. The trail was quiet but not peaceful. It was as if the forest held its breath, a silent tension pressing in on him from all sides. His heart pounded faster, each rustling leaf and broken twig echoing like footsteps in his mind. He quickened his pace, the shadows seeming to close in around him, twisting and reaching as if alive. His breath came in shallow gasps, his mind racing. "It's just the dark," he repeated, but the words did little to calm his growing unease. Finally, he saw the glow of streetlights ahead, a beacon of safety. With a sigh of relief, he hurried out of the woods, the feeling of being followed fading as he stepped back into the familiar streets. The shadows of the forest were behind him, but the unease lingered, leaving a cold weight in his chest. When he arrived home, he felt drained, as though something had been taken from him. He shook it off, dismissing it as nerves, but as he sat alone in his dim apartment, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The shadows seemed thicker, more oppressive, and his mind wandered back to the forest, to the strange sensation of being watched. The next morning, Tom's alarm startled him awake, and he stumbled out of bed, still feeling oddly unsettled. He brushed his teeth, washed his face, and prepared for work with the same routine he followed every day. But as he reached for his coffee cup, he froze. The mug was different, an old, familiar mug he'd owned for years, but had discarded just last month. He hadn't thought about it since, but there it was, sitting on his counter as though it had never been thrown away. Confused, he stared at it, trying to recall what had happened to his usual cup. Had he been mistaken? Had he somehow forgotten throwing it away? He picked it up, inspecting the chipped handle and faded design. It felt solid in his hand, real and yet wrong, as though it didn't belong in his home anymore. He shook his head, setting the mug down with a shrug. It was just a coffee cup. He was overthinking things, letting his mind wander, but the unease clung to him, following him out the door and all the way to work. At the office, things felt equally strange. His co-worker Amy greeted him with a cheerful, "Hey Tom!" But the name she called him wasn't right. She called him Thomas, not Tom. She'd always called him Tom, everyone did. The odd name echoed in his mind, unsettling him further. He frowned, correcting her, but Amy only laughed, brushing it off as if he were the one who was mistaken. "I've always called you Thomas," she insisted, her tone light. But her eyes held a faint, unsettling distance, like she was looking at a stranger. Throughout the day, small details continued to feel wrong. His keyboard was switched out for an older model he hadn't used in years, and his desk was arranged differently than he remembered. Even his files seemed out of order, marked with dates he didn't recognize, clients he'd never heard of. He asked his supervisor about the changes, but she simply gave him a strange look, insisting that nothing had been moved. The oddities grew, each one compounding his unease, his sense of reality slipping further away. By the end of the day, he felt like a stranger in his own life, as though everything familiar had been replaced with subtle, eerie distortions. By some of the thumbs up on that evening, as he returned home, Tom was plagued by a strange, restless energy. His apartment seemed colder, darker than he remembered. and the silence pressed down on him with an oppressive weight. He wandered through his home, checking each room, his eyes scanning for anything that felt out of place. But everything was as it should be. Yet somehow, nothing felt right. Then, in a fleeting moment, he saw it. A shadow, darker than the rest, lingering in the corner of his living room. It didn't move, didn't shift, but seemed to watch him. A presence just on the edge of his vision. He blinked, and it was gone, leaving only the faintest hint of unease prickling his skin. He turned on all the lights, his heart pounding, but the feeling of being watched remained. He locked the doors, closed the curtains, and even double-checked every corner of his apartment, searching for something, anything, that would explain the strange feeling. But there was nothing. Finally, exhausted and defeated, he sat down at his kitchen table, his mind racing. He thought about the mug, about Amy calling him Thomas, about the shadow in the corner. These things weren't just coincidences. He could feel it, a faint sense that something was slipping away, something vital and irreplaceable. Unable to shake the feeling, he decided to start keeping a record. He grabbed a notebook and began writing down everything he could remember about the past few days, every detail he could recall. His pen scratched across the paper, each line grounding him, anchoring him to his memories. As he wrote, he felt a small sense of control returning, a fragile barrier against the growing darkness in his life. But as he reached the end of the page, he felt a strange hesitation, a feeling as though something was watching him from over his shoulder. He glanced up, but the room was empty, the shadows undisturbed. He turned back to the notebook, his fingers trembling, and flipped the page, intending to continue. But the next page was already filled with writing. His own handwriting sprawled across the page, words he didn't remember writing, events he couldn't recall. The words described the night before, detailing his walk through the forest, the sense of being followed, the feeling of something watching him. But as he read further, the words grew darker, the descriptions twisting into something unsettling. The writing spoke of a presence, a shadow that lingered just out of sight, feeding off his fear, burrowing into his memories. He flipped through the next few pages, finding more entries he didn't recognize, each one more disturbing than the last. They described events that hadn't happened, conversations he'd never had, places he'd never been, each one feeling more real than the last. His own life seemed to be slipping through his fingers, replaced by a reality he couldn't control. Panic gripped him, his hands shaking as he dropped the notebook. He looked around, his heart pounding, as if expecting to see the shadow watching him from the corner of the room. But there was nothing, only silence and darkness pressing in around him. And in that silence, a thought took root. A chilling realization that sent a shiver down his spine. The shadow hadn't just been watching him. It was inside him, slipping into his life, changing his memories, his reality, one piece at a time. Chapter 2. The Missing Days. Tom awoke the next morning with a start, drenched in cold sweat, his heart pounding as though he had been running for miles. The images from last night flooded back to him. The shadow, the altered memories, the strange entries in his notebook. He reached for it, desperate to see if they were still there, to confirm if the nightmare had been real. But when he flipped to the pages he'd seen the night before, his heart sank. The entries were gone. His notebook was blank. Each page, from beginning to end, was a clean slate, as though no words had ever been written. He flipped through it twice, then 3 times, unable to believe what he was seeing, or what he wasn't seeing. Every memory he had written down, every thought he had recorded, had vanished as if they'd never existed. A cold dread filled his chest, and he stumbled out of bed, gripping the notebook like a lifeline. The silence in his apartment was unnaturally thick, the air stale and oppressive. Shadows seemed to linger at the edges of his vision, but every time he turned to look, they would dissipate, leaving only an uneasy emptiness behind. He tried to remember what he had written the night before, but his memory was hazy, as though a thick fog had settled over his mind, obscuring details he should have known. He could recall the feeling of the pen in his hand, the quiet scratching on the paper, but the actual words eluded him. Every time he tried to remember them, a sharp pain spiked in his temples, forcing him to look away, to forget some. At work, things felt equally wrong. His co-workers greeted him with distant, almost empty smiles, as though he were a stranger. He noticed strange details that seemed out of place. The nameplate on his desk now read Thomas instead of Tom, and his email inbox was flooded with messages from people he didn't recognize, discussing projects he had no memory of. He tried to focus, to read through the emails and catch up on his new assignments, but each message only heightened his unease. The names of clients, the details of meetings, the files on his computer, all of it felt alien, like fragments of a life he'd never lived. The clock on his computer read 10:47 a.m., yet it felt like hours had passed since he'd arrived. Time itself felt slippery, distorted, as though reality was pulling him in and out of focus. At lunchtime, he checked his phone, hoping to find some semblance of normalcy, but even that betrayed him. Messages from friends were filled with events he couldn't remember, references to gatherings he hadn't attended. It was as if a version of him had gone to these places, spoken these words, yet he had no memory of any of it. Then, as he scrolled through his messages, he found one that chilled him to the bone. A text from a friend read, "Hey Thomas, last night was fun. We should go back there sometime." He reread the text, his mind spinning. The friend was someone he hadn't seen in months, yet here was a message implying they had spent the previous night together. It made no sense. He hadn't seen anyone the night before. He'd been alone, fighting the shadows in his own mind. He checked the date on his phone and felt the floor drop out from beneath him. The phone displayed today's date as Tuesday, but he remembered going to bed on Sunday. A full day had vanished from his life, slipping through his fingers without a trace. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. A whole day, gone. He tried to recall anything. Waking up, going to work, talking to someone. But his mind was blank, an empty void where yesterday should have been. His heart pounded, his skin clammy as the dread settled in. That night, Tom went home in a daze, feeling like a man caught between two worlds. The apartment felt colder than before, the shadows thicker and more oppressive, pressing in on him from every corner. He went to his bedroom, hoping for some escape in sleep, but the sight of his reflection stopped him cold. In the dim light, his face looked unfamiliar, his features sharper, more angular, as though he were staring at a distorted version of himself. His eyes, usually brown, appeared darker, almost black, and there was a hollowness in his gaze, a vacancy that filled him with a sense of dread. He looked away, afraid of what he might see if he kept staring, and crawled into bed, pulling the covers over himself. But sleep didn't come easily. Every time he closed his eyes, he felt a presence lingering beside him, a cold weight pressing down on his chest, whispering to him from the darkness. And then, in the early hours of the morning, he heard it. "Thomas." The voice was soft, barely a whisper, but it was unmistakable. It was his own voice, distorted, echoing through his mind. He opened his eyes, staring into the darkness, his heart pounding. The room was empty, yet the feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. The whisper came again, closer this time, sliding into his mind like a cold blade. "You invited me in, and now I'm part of you." He bolted upright, his breath coming in shallow gasps. But the room was silent once more, the shadows undisturbed. He tried to calm himself, to convince himself it was just a bad dream, but the memory of the whisper lingered, cold and relentless. He glanced at the clock. It was 4:13 a.m. He could feel the weight of exhaustion pressing down on him, but every time he closed his eyes, the whisper returned, louder, closer, filling his mind until he thought he might go mad. By the time morning arrived, he felt like a ghost, barely aware of his own surroundings. He stumbled through his morning routine, the events of the previous day blurring together, slipping away from him even as he tried to hold on to them. But as he reached for his keys to leave for work, he froze. His calendar, which hung by the door, showed today's date as Thursday. He blinked, his mind struggling to process the impossibility of it. Tuesday had only just begun. He'd gone to bed on Sunday. Yet now, he was missing another 2 days. A wave of panic crashed over him, leaving him breathless, his thoughts spiraling into darkness. He couldn't recall anything from those missing days, nothing but a faint sense of dread, a feeling of being watched, of shadows closing in around him. Desperate for answers, he returned to his notebook, hoping that perhaps he had written something, anything that might explain the gaps in his memory. But the pages were blank, as though the events of the past few days had been wiped clean, leaving only emptiness. Tom sat there, gripping the notebook, his mind racing. The shadow wasn't just haunting him, it was erasing him piece by piece, taking days, memories, fragments of his life that he would never get back, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. As he sat there, paralyzed by fear, he noticed something strange on the edge of his vision. A faint, dark shape, barely perceptible, but undeniably there. A shadow, lingering just beyond the edge of his sight, watching him. He turned to look, but it disappeared, slipping away like smoke, leaving only the faintest trace of unease. The fear grew, spreading like a poison through his mind. He could feel the shadow's presence pressing against him, its cold, malevolent energy seeping into his thoughts, twisting his memories, erasing pieces of his identity. In a moment of desperation, he grabbed his phone and called his mother, hoping to find some sense of grounding, a connection to reality. But when she answered, her voice was distant, almost unfamiliar, as though she were speaking to a stranger. "Hello?" she said, her tone hesitant. "Mom, it's me." "Tom," he replied, his voice shaking. I need to talk to you. Something's happening to me, and I don't know how to stop it." There was a long pause, and then she replied, her voice filled with confusion. "Tom, I'm sorry. I don't have a son named Tom." The words hit him like a blow, leaving him speechless, the phone slipping from his grasp. He could hear her voice on the other end, faint and distant, as though coming from another world. And in that moment, he realized the truth. The shadow hadn't just been taking his memories, it was erasing him, severing his connections to the people he loved, erasing every trace of his existence. Tom stared into the empty room, the shadows closing in around him, and felt a cold, overwhelming terror settle over him. He was slipping away, fading into nothingness, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Chapter 3. The Fragmented Past. Tom could no longer distinguish his days from his nights. Time itself felt warped, twisted, as if the hours were slipping through his fingers like grains of sand. Each morning, he would wake with only fragments of memories, bits and pieces of events that felt like they belonged to someone else. The feeling of being hollow, of something vital missing, gnawed at him constantly, growing worse with each passing day. The worst part was the apartment. It felt like a stranger's space now, unfamiliar, unwelcoming. Objects he could have sworn were his own now seemed foreign, as though someone had carefully placed them there to mock him. His once beloved photos on the wall had faded, the faces blurred and distorted, like shadows of memories he could no longer reach. Desperation clawed at him, and he found himself pacing, frantically searching for something tangible, something real. His heart pounded as he moved from room to room, opening drawers, rummaging through closets, looking for any trace of his past that remained untouched. But everything he touched felt wrong, as though it belonged to someone else entirely. Then, he found a small box shoved to the back of his closet, a box he barely remembered. It was dusty, forgotten, with his name scrawled messily on the lid in his own handwriting. Inside were old mementos, childhood trinkets, a few photographs, a pocket watch that had belonged to his grandfather. These were things he couldn't have forgotten. He should have remembered each one vividly. Yet as he held each object, the memories they were supposed to unlock felt distant, hollow, as though he were viewing them from the outside. Tom clutched the pocket watch, tracing its cold, familiar shape with his thumb. But no matter how he tried, he couldn't recall his grandfather's face. The memory was there, just out of reach, like a photograph blurred beyond recognition. Panic surged through him as he realized that even his most cherished memories were slipping away. He went to the mirror, clutching the watch tightly, and stared into his own eyes, hoping to find himself there. But his reflection felt foreign, his own gaze hollow and empty. A stranger stared back at him, with dark, sunken eyes and a face devoid of warmth. In his eyes he saw shadows shifting, twisting in shapes that didn't belong. "Who are you?" he whispered, the words barely audible. The reflection's mouth curled into a faint, mocking smile, a glint of malice flickering in its darkened eyes. His breath hitched, and he staggered back, his hand gripping the edge of the sink to steady himself. "Get out of my head," he whispered, his voice trembling. But even as he said the words, he knew they were futile. The shadow wasn't simply in his head. It was becoming a part of him, replacing him piece by piece. He staggered back from the mirror, dropping the pocket watch, which landed with a dull thud on the floor. Desperation clawed at him, and he knew he couldn't stay in the apartment any longer. The walls felt as though they were closing in on him, the shadows stretching, darkening, filling every corner with an oppressive weight. Tom left his apartment, barely remembering how he'd gotten out onto the street. He moved through the city in a daze, his mind fragmented, each thought slipping away before he could grasp it. He passed strangers who looked at him with faint confusion, as though sensing something was wrong, but he kept his gaze down, afraid of what he might see in their eyes. He wandered for hours, the buildings blurring together, each street looking the same as the last. He couldn't remember where he was going or why he had left his apartment in the first place. All he knew was that he couldn't go back, that he had to keep moving, as though the very act of stopping would allow the shadow to consume him completely. Eventually, he found himself at a small deserted park. The place was familiar, yet distant, as though it were a memory he'd forgotten long ago. He sat on an old bench, the wood splintered and worn, and buried his face in his hands, his mind racing with fear and confusion. "What's happening to me?" he whispered, his voice breaking. But the only response was the empty, silent darkness pressing in around him. And then he heard it. A faint whisper, soft and sinister, floating through the air like a chill. It was his own voice, calling to him from somewhere deep within his mind. "You let me in, and now I'm here to stay." Tom's body tensed, every nerve on edge. The voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, echoing in his thoughts, slipping into the spaces between his memories. He looked around, searching for the source, but the park was empty, the shadows still and silent. "You thought you could forget me, but I'm part of you now. I've always been here, waiting." The words sent a shiver down his spine. He realized with a cold certainty that the shadow wasn't just something outside of him, something haunting him from afar. It was inside him, a piece of himself he had never known, a darkness that had been lurking in his mind, waiting for a chance to emerge. "Why are you doing this?" he whispered, his voice trembling. "What do you want?" The answer was a low, menacing chuckle, filling his mind with a cold, consuming dread. "I want what you have, Thomas. I want everything." Tom gripped the edge of the bench, his knuckles white as the whisper continued, relentless, seeping into his thoughts, drowning out his own voice. He could feel it slipping into his memories, twisting them, erasing the fragments of his identity that he had fought so hard to hold on to. He closed his eyes, trying to shut out the voice, to block it from his mind. But it was there, lurking in the darkness, slipping into every corner of his thoughts, filling him with images of things he didn't recognize. Strange faces, distorted places, moments that felt both familiar and foreign. He saw himself standing in an empty room, staring into a mirror that reflected a twisted, distorted version of his own face. He saw himself wandering through a dark, endless corridor, shadows reaching out to pull him in, and he saw the forest, the place where it had all begun, where he had felt the shadow's presence for the first time. The images faded, leaving only a heavy, suffocating silence. Tom opened his eyes, his vision blurred, his mind fractured. He didn't know who he was anymore, didn't know if the memories he clung to were even his own. All he knew was the fear, the overwhelming sense of something hollow and empty inside him, a darkness that was slowly consuming him. Chakshamorwa. In a last, desperate attempt, he pulled out his phone and dialed the only number he could remember. Sarah's. She was a co-worker he hadn't spoken to in months, a faint memory that felt fragile, as though it could vanish at any moment. But he clung to it, hoping that she might remember him, that she might still see him as he was. The phone rang, each ring echoing in his mind, a lifeline slipping further and further away. Finally, she answered, her voice soft, hesitant. "Hello?" "Sarah, it's Tom," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. I need help. Something's happening to me. I think I'm disappearing." There was a long pause, and he could hear her breathing on the other end. When she finally spoke, her voice was distant, uncertain. "Tom, I'm sorry, I don't know who you are." The words hit him like a punch to the gut, leaving him breathless. He tried to respond, to say something, but his voice caught in his throat, trapped beneath the weight of the darkness that filled him. The call ended, leaving him alone, surrounded by silence and shadows. His last connection, his last hope, had slipped away, leaving only emptiness in its place. And in that silence, he felt it. A cold, dark presence settling over him, filling the spaces where his memories used to be. The shadow was there, lurking just beneath the surface, waiting to consume him completely. As he sat there, alone in the empty park, he knew that he was no longer himself. He was a fragment, a hollow shell, a vessel for something darker, something that had been waiting for this moment all along. The last remnants of his identity slipped away, leaving only darkness, only silence, only the whisper of a shadow that had claimed him, body and soul. Chapter 4. The Vanishing Reflection. The days melted into one another, and Tom's life unraveled further. He was trapped, his own mind and memories slipping away. It felt like drowning in slow motion, as if he were a stone sinking deeper into a dark, endless void. Each morning, he woke with less of himself, and each night, he felt more of the shadow filling the spaces he could no longer remember. It had been days, he thought at least, since he'd last spoken to anyone. Every attempt to reach out was met with blank confusion or outright denial. His friends, his family, even co-workers, now greeted him with unrecognizing eyes, as though he were a stranger. They couldn't see the person he was anymore, and soon, Tom feared, neither would he. Desperation drove him to search for answers in places he'd never considered. He read online forums, searched for similar accounts of memory loss and haunting shadows, but nothing he found matched his experiences. Every article he read, every story he encountered, only increased his sense of isolation. Whatever was happening to him was beyond anything he could comprehend. One night, as Tom sat alone in the dim light of his apartment, he noticed something in the corner of his eye. A shadow, darker and denser than the others, lingering just at the edge of his vision. It didn't move, didn't shift, but he felt its presence, a cold, heavy weight pressing down on him. When he turned to face it, it disappeared, but the feeling remained, a suffocating dread that clung to him like a second skin. Driven by an impulse he couldn't explain, Tom went to the bathroom mirror, his hands trembling as he flicked on the light. His reflection stared back at him, hollow and gaunt, the shadows under his eyes dark and pronounced. He barely recognized himself. He leaned closer, studying his own face, searching for any trace of the man he had once been. But as he looked, he felt an unsettling sensation, as if his reflection were watching him with a mind of its own. His eyes, once a warm brown, seemed darker, almost black, and they held a faint, mocking glint that made his stomach turn. He blinked, but the glint remained, and his reflection's mouth curved into a faint smile, a smile he hadn't made. Tom's heart raced, his hands gripping the edge of the sink. Who are you?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. The reflection's smile widened, and it leaned forward, mimicking his movements with an eerie precision. But its eyes held a malevolence, a darkness that wasn't his own. For a moment, he thought he saw something else, a faint, shadowy figure lurking just behind his reflection, watching him with cold, hollow eyes. "You know who I am," the reflection whispered, its voice soft, sinister. "I'm the part of you that you tried to forget, that you thought you could bury, but I am still here, Thomas. I have always been here." A chill ran down his spine, and he took a step back, his breath coming in shallow gasps. The reflection's smile faded, replaced by an expression of quiet amusement, as though it found his fear amusing. You can't escape me, it continued, its voice a low, haunting murmur. I am woven into your memories, your thoughts. Every moment you've forgotten, every face you can't remember. I am there, filling the spaces you left behind. Tom shook his head, his body trembling. No, this isn't real. You're not real. The reflection chuckled, a cold, mocking sound that echoed in the small bathroom. Aren't I? You let me in, Thomas. You invited me into your life, and now I am your life. Soon you won't even remember who you were. There will be only me. The words settled over him like a curse, and he felt his mind fracturing, his memories slipping away, piece by piece. He stumbled out of the bathroom, his vision blurring, the walls closing in around him as he tried to escape the suffocating presence. But the shadow was everywhere. It followed him, lurking just out of sight, slipping into his thoughts, filling his mind with dark whispers, half-forgotten memories, and images that felt both foreign and familiar. That night, Tom tried to sleep, but the whispers wouldn't let him rest. They filled his mind, seeping into his dreams, transforming them into nightmares that felt too real. He found himself wandering through dark, endless corridors, his footsteps echoing in the silence, the walls closing in around him. He was searching for something, someone, faces he could no longer remember, voices that faded as soon as he reached for them. Shadows moved around him, whispering his name, calling to him with a mocking familiarity. In one dream, he stood before a large mirror, staring into his own reflection. But this time, the reflection didn't mimic his movements. It simply stared at him, its eyes hollow and dark, its mouth twisted into a cruel smile. You belong to me, it whispered, its voice soft, insidious. You are nothing without me. He tried to turn away to escape, but the mirror surrounded him, trapping him in his own reflection, his own darkness. The shadow closed in, filling every corner of his mind, and he could feel himself slipping away, his identity dissolving into the darkness. He woke with a start, gasping for breath, his body drenched in sweat. The room was dark, the air thick with an oppressive silence. He sat up, his heart pounding, his mind racing. He could feel the shadow lingering in the darkness, watching him, waiting for him to surrender. In a desperate attempt to regain control, Tom returned to the notebook he had abandoned days ago. He flipped to a blank page, his hands shaking as he began to write, recording every detail he could remember, every memory that hadn't yet slipped away. But as he wrote, he noticed something strange. The words on the page seemed to shift, twisting into shapes he couldn't recognize. His handwriting transformed before his eyes, the letters forming sentences he hadn't written, words he didn't understand. He tried to focus, to read the strange text, but the words slipped away from him, like water through his fingers. The harder he tried to remember, the more they blurred, until they dissolved into nothingness, leaving only blank pages. Frustration and fear clawed at him, and he threw the notebook across the room, watching as it landed with a soft thud. He felt trapped, his mind and memories slipping further from his grasp with each passing moment. He was losing himself, and the shadow was taking his place. Days passed, or perhaps hours. He couldn't tell anymore. Time had become meaningless, a blur of dark moments and half-remembered fragments. He wandered through his apartment like a ghost, his movements sluggish, his thoughts fractured. The reflection in the mirror grew more distorted, more sinister. His own face had become a stranger's, the eyes dark and empty, the mouth twisted into a mocking smile. The shadow had fully taken over, and he could feel its influence growing stronger, filling every corner of his mind. One night, as he sat in the dim light of his apartment, he felt a strange sensation, a pull, a tugging at the edges of his consciousness. It was as though something were calling to him, a dark presence beckoning him deeper into the shadows. He followed the sensation, his body moving without his control, his mind blank, empty. He walked to the mirror, his own reflection staring back at him with hollow eyes, a faint smile on its lips. The shadow's voice filled his mind, soft and insidious. It's time, Thomas. Time to let go. He felt his own will slipping, his thoughts dissolving into darkness. The reflection reached out, its hand pressing against the glass, its eyes locked onto his. He raised his own hand, pressing it against the cold surface, feeling a strange sense of surrender, of peace. As his hand touched the glass, the shadow's voice echoed in his mind, a final whisper that sent a shiver through his soul. You are mine now, forever. And as the darkness closed in around him, he knew that there was no escape, no hope of reclaiming his life. He had become nothing more than a vessel, a shell for the shadow that had consumed him. In the silence that followed, there was only darkness, only emptiness, only the faint echo of a life that had once been his own. Chapter 5. The Stranger in the Mirror. Tom woke with a hollow ache in his chest, a numbness that had settled into his bones. His apartment was dark, the shadows dense and heavy, as if they had seeped into the walls, becoming a part of the very structure. He felt like a stranger in his own home, each room a foreign land populated by unsettling shadows that seemed to follow him wherever he went. As he stood, his body felt alien, stiff, as though he hadn't moved for days. The world around him felt muted, every sound muffled, every colour faded, leaving only the dark and the cold. He had lost track of time, unsure of how long he had been drifting in and out of consciousness, his mind slipping further away with each passing moment. The mirror in the hallway drew him, a magnetic pull that he couldn't resist. He approached it slowly, his heart pounding, his mind screaming at him to look away, but he couldn't. His own reflection stared back at him, distorted and wrong, a twisted version of himself that made his skin crawl. The face in the mirror was his, but it wasn't. The eyes were hollow, dark pits that seemed to suck in all light, and the faintest hint of a cruel smile played at the corners of its mouth. He could feel its gaze boring into him, a darkness that reached into his soul, unearthing every fear, every insecurity he had ever buried. Tom took a step back, his pulse quickening, but the reflection didn't follow. It stayed where it was, watching him, a slight sneer tugging at its lips. "Who are you?" he whispered, his voice barely more than a breath. The reflection's mouth moved, but the words that spilled out weren't his own. "You already know." The voice was soft, mocking, and it echoed through the room, filling the air with a chill that seeped into his skin. Tom shook his head, trying to shake off the feeling, but the reflection leaned closer, its eyes narrowing. "You invited me in, Thomas. Don't you remember? All those nights spent staring into the dark, letting the shadows slip into your thoughts." The reflection's voice was a whisper, a cold hiss that made the hair on his neck stand on end. "I am the part of you that you tried to bury, the fear you thought you could ignore, but I am still here, and now I am free." Tom's stomach twisted as the realization settled over him, the weight of it pressing down on him like a stone. The shadow wasn't just haunting him, it was him. Every fear, every doubt, every dark thought he had ever tried to suppress had manifested into this entity, this twisted reflection that was slowly taking over his life. He backed away, his breaths coming in shallow gasps. "No, this isn't real. You're not real." The reflection laughed, a hollow, chilling sound that echoed in his mind. "Aren't I? You let me in, Thomas. You fed me every time you gave in to your fear, every time you let the darkness consume you. And now, I am stronger than ever." Tom felt his legs weaken, and he stumbled, his back hitting the wall. The room felt smaller, the walls pressing in on him, the shadows growing darker, thicker, filling every corner. Desperation clawed at him, and he looked around, searching for a way out. But the reflection's voice stopped him cold. "There is no escape, Thomas. You are mine now. Your thoughts, your memories, your life. They all belong to me." He felt a coldness spreading through his chest, a numbness that seemed to seep into his bones, his mind growing foggy, distant. The reflection's gaze held him captive, its eyes dark and hollow, yet filled with a cruel satisfaction. "Soon, you won't even remember who you are," it whispered, its voice a dark promise. "You will be nothing more than a vessel, a shadow of the man you once were." Tom's mind raced, panic settling in as he struggled to hold on to his identity, to cling to the memories that felt like they were slipping through his fingers. He thought of his family, his friends, the life he had built. But even as he tried to remember, the images grew blurry, the faces fading, replaced by shadows that seemed to close in on him. In a last, desperate attempt, he turned away from the mirror, stumbling toward his bedroom, hoping that distance would break the reflection's hold on him. But the voice followed, a whisper that slipped into his thoughts, filling his mind with a darkness that felt like a weight pressing down on him. Run all you want, Thomas. I am part of you now. There is no escape. He slammed the door shut behind him, his breaths coming in ragged gasps. The room was dark, the shadows thick and suffocating, pressing in from all sides. He felt as though he were drowning, his mind slipping further and further into the darkness. Desperation clawed at him, and he grabbed the nearest object, a small framed photo on his bedside table. He stared at the photo, a faint memory surfacing, a flicker of something real, something his. It was a picture of him and his sister, taken years ago, both of them smiling, laughing. But as he looked closer, the faces began to blur, the image distorting, as though the darkness were seeping into the photo, erasing it. His heart pounded, his grip tightening on the frame as he struggled to hold on to the memory. You can't hold on to them, Thomas, the voice whispered, a dark chuckle echoing through the room. Everything you know, everything you are, it will all fade. He gritted his teeth, fighting against the voice, forcing himself to remember. He thought of his childhood, of the people he had loved, of every moment that had made him who he was. But each memory felt fragile, slipping through his mind like sand, replaced by shadows, by a darkness that felt infinite. And then he felt it. A cold hand on his shoulder, a weight that made his skin crawl. He didn't need to turn around to know what it was. The shadow was there, standing right behind him, its presence filling the room with an oppressive, suffocating dread. Let go, Thomas, it whispered, its voice soft, insidious. Give in to the darkness. It's easier that way. But he couldn't. He wouldn't. With a surge of defiance, he turned, facing the shadow, his heart pounding as he met its hollow, empty gaze. I won't let you take me, he said, his voice shaking but resolute. I won't become you. The shadow's face twisted into a mocking smile, its eyes glinting with a dark amusement. You already have. In that moment, he felt a sharp, searing pain in his mind, as though something were being torn from him. The memories he had clung to, the fragments of his life were ripped away, leaving only darkness, only emptiness. He fell to his knees, gasping, his vision blurring as the shadow closed in, its voice a whisper in his mind. You are nothing, Thomas. Nothing but a vessel for the darkness. And as the last remnants of his identity slipped away, he felt himself fading, dissolving into the shadows, becoming one with the darkness that had claimed him. The room grew silent, the only sound the faint whisper of the shadow's laughter, echoing through the empty, hollow space that had once been his mind. Chapter 6. The Descent. The world outside his apartment had faded to a memory, and Tom was slipping deeper into a strange half-existence, a place where time no longer felt real, and his mind seemed to unravel with every passing second. He knew the apartment's layout by heart, but now every corner seemed foreign, every wall a looming monolith of shadows. Days, or perhaps hours, had passed since he last heard his own thoughts clearly. His mind had become a battlefield, a relentless struggle against the darkness clawing at him. His memories were fractured, flickering images that blurred as soon as he tried to hold on to them. He was losing himself, and the shadow knew it. The walls around him seemed to pulse with a dark energy, as though the shadow had seeped into the apartment itself. He wandered the dim rooms like a ghost, his footsteps slow and uncertain, as though he were moving through thick fog. Every reflection in the glass, every shadow cast on the walls, seemed to watch him, waiting for him to surrender, to let go. But Tom couldn't. He refused to give in completely, clinging to the last shreds of his sanity, his identity. Somewhere, deep in the recesses of his mind, he still existed. A faint spark, a glimmer of the person he had once been. It was all he had left, and he held onto it with a desperation he had never known before. As he wandered the apartment, he felt a pull, a strange sensation that led him to his bedroom. The room was dark, the shadows thick and heavy, filling every corner. He stepped inside, his heart pounding as he felt the shadow's presence pressing down on him, suffocating, relentless. The mirror on the wall drew his gaze, a dark, glassy void that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. He approached it slowly, his breath shallow, his hands shaking. The reflection staring back at him was barely recognizable, a hollow, twisted version of himself, with eyes as black as the void, empty and soulless. "Is this what you want?" he whispered, his voice trembling. "To take everything I am? To leave nothing but a shell?" The reflection's mouth curved into a mocking smile, its eyes gleaming with a cruel satisfaction. "You gave me permission, Thomas. All those nights you spent staring into the darkness, inviting me in. I was there, waiting. You fed me with your fears, your doubts, until I became strong enough to take what you wouldn't face." Tom felt a surge of anger, a spark of defiance that cut through the fear. "I never asked for this. You took my life, my memories. You stole everything from me." The reflection tilted its head, its smile widening. "I didn't steal anything, Thomas. I am you. Every shadow, every dark thought you've ever had. I am the part of you that you tried to hide, the darkness you thought you could ignore. But you were wrong." Tom gritted his teeth, his fists clenched at his sides. "You're not me. You're nothing but a parasite, feeding on my life." The reflection's laughter was a low, hollow sound that echoed in the room, filling every corner with a chilling resonance. "A parasite? No, Thomas. I am your true self, the one you've been hiding from all along. You created me, and now I am all that's left." A cold wave of dread washed over him as he felt the truth in the reflection's words. The shadow wasn't just an outside force. It was a part of him, a manifestation of every fear, every doubt he had ever buried. It had grown in the dark corners of his mind, feeding on his insecurities, his weaknesses, until it had become a force strong enough to take control. Desperation clawed at him, and he took a step back, his mind racing. He had to do something, anything to fight back, to reclaim the parts of himself that the shadow hadn't yet consumed. He turned away from the mirror, his eyes scanning the room for something, anything that could help him. In the corner of his room, half buried under a pile of old belongings, he found it, an old journal he had kept years ago. He picked it up, his hands trembling as he flipped through the pages. Each entry was a glimpse into a different time, a different version of himself, a person who had dreams, hopes, a life filled with meaning. The memories were faint, but they were real. He read through the entries, each word grounding him, reminding him of who he was, of who he had been. The shadow's presence pressed against him, a cold weight, but he forced himself to focus, to cling to the memories that felt like lifelines. "You think that will save you?" the shadow's voice hissed, slipping into his thoughts, cold and mocking. "You think you can fight me with words on a page?" Tom ignored the voice, his mind narrowing to a single purpose: to remember, to reclaim his identity. He read through the journal, each entry strengthening his resolve, his memories growing sharper, more vivid. He remembered his family, his friends, the people who had shaped his life. He remembered his passions, the things that had once given him purpose. He remembered the person he had been, the person he still was, buried deep beneath the darkness. The shadow's grip on his mind loosened, and he felt a surge of hope, a flicker of light in the darkness. He clung to it, feeding it with every memory, every piece of himself that he could recall. But the shadow was relentless. It fought back, filling his mind with whispers, with doubts, twisting his memories, tainting them with darkness. The faces of his loved ones blurred, their voices fading, replaced by shadows that mocked him, laughed at his weakness. "You can't escape me, Thomas," the shadow hissed, its voice a cold, insidious whisper. "You are mine, every thought, every memory, they all belong to me." Tom's resolve wavered, the darkness pressing in, filling his mind with fear, with despair. But he forced himself to hold on, to cling to the memories that felt real, that felt like him. He wouldn't let the shadow take everything. He wouldn't let it erase him. In a final act of defiance, he grabbed a pen and began to write in the journal, his hand shaking as he scrawled his name, his thoughts, his memories onto the page. Each word was a piece of himself, a fragment of his identity, a declaration that he still existed, that he was still here. The shadow's voice grew louder, a scream that filled his mind, but he ignored it, his focus narrowing to the page, to the words that felt like anchors, grounding him in reality. And then, just as he finished writing his name, the room grew silent. The shadows retreated, the oppressive weight lifting, leaving only the faint echo of his own heartbeat, steady and strong. He looked down at the journal, at the words he had written, his own handwriting clear and unmistakable. The shadow's presence was still there, a faint whisper in the back of his mind, but he had regained control, had reclaimed his identity. For the first time in days, perhaps weeks, he felt a sense of peace, a sense of self that the shadow hadn't been able to erase. He was still here, still himself, and he wouldn't let the darkness take that from him. The journey ahead would be difficult, he knew. The shadow would always be there, lurking in the corners of his mind, waiting for a moment of weakness. But he had faced it, had fought back, and had won. And as he sat there, the journal clutched in his hands, he knew that he would keep fighting, that he would hold on to his identity, his memories, his life. Chapter 7. Beneath the Surface. The apartment had grown quiet, unnaturally so, as though the very air had thickened and settled around Tom in a suffocating shroud. The journal lay open in his lap, the ink on the pages still fresh. Each word he'd written served as a lifeline, binding him back to reality, pulling him out of the shadow's grip. Yet, in the dim light, he could feel the shadow's presence looming, watching from the darkened corners, waiting for him to falter. As the hours passed, he remained rooted to the same spot, gripping the journal as if it were a sacred relic, his only defense against the consuming darkness that threatened to engulf him. But as his mind drifted and exhaustion crept in, doubts began to cloud his thoughts. He wondered if he had really won, or if the shadow was merely lying in wait, biding its time until he was vulnerable again. It wasn't long before his fears were realized. A faint whisper echoed from the hallway, a soft, haunting murmur that filled the silence. He froze, his heartbeat quickening as the whisper grew louder, more insistent. The words were indistinct, but they carried a sinister familiarity that sent a chill through him. He recognized the voice. It was his own, twisted and hollow, echoing back at him from the darkness. "You think you've won, don't you, Thomas?" the voice taunted, slithering into his thoughts like a serpent. "You think you can keep me away with words on a page?" Tom clenched his jaw, his fists tightening around the journal. "You're nothing but a shadow," he whispered, his voice trembling but defiant. "A figment of my fears. You can't take control unless I let you." The voice laughed, a low, mocking sound that resonated through the apartment. "Oh, Thomas, I'm more than a shadow. I am every dark thought you've ever had, every doubt, every regret. You created me, and now I'm all that's left." He forced himself to stand, clutching the journal to his chest like a shield. "No, you're wrong," he said, his voice wavering but resolute. "I'm still here. I'm still me." But even as he spoke the words, he could feel the shadow creeping closer, slipping into his thoughts, seeping into his mind. His vision blurred, the edges of reality fading as the voice grew louder, filling his mind with whispers that twisted and distorted his memories. "You can't hold on to them, Thomas," the voice murmured, its tone soft, almost pitying. "Memories fade, people change, and soon you'll be nothing but a hollow shell, a vessel for the darkness." A wave of despair washed over him, and he felt his grip on the journal loosen. The words on the pages seemed to blur, the ink fading, as though the memories themselves were slipping away. He could feel the shadow's influence growing stronger, a cold, oppressive weight that settled over him, pressing down on his thoughts, his identity. Desperation clawed at him, and he staggered toward the hallway, the walls seeming to close in around him as he moved. He needed to get out, to escape the suffocating darkness that filled every corner of the apartment. But with each step, the voice grew louder, mocking him, taunting him. "There's nowhere to run, Thomas," it whispered, its voice dripping with malice. "I am everywhere. I am in the walls, the shadows, the very air you breathe. You can't escape me." He stumbled, his vision blurring as he reached the front door, his hand trembling as he fumbled with the lock. He managed to open the door, and the cold night air hit him like a wave, snapping him back to reality, grounding him, if only for a moment. He stepped out into the hallway, his heart racing as he looked back at the apartment, half expecting to see the shadow standing in the doorway, watching him with those hollow, empty eyes. But the doorway was empty, the apartment silent. For a brief moment, he felt a flicker of relief, a faint glimmer of hope. But as he turned to leave, he heard the whisper again, closer this time, as if it were right beside him. "You can run, Thomas, but you can't hide." He bolted, his footsteps echoing down the empty hallway as he fled, his mind racing, his thoughts a chaotic whirl of fear and desperation. He didn't know where he was going or what he would do, but he knew he couldn't stay, couldn't let the shadow consume him. He stumbled out into the street, the cold night air biting at his skin, the darkness stretching out before him like an endless abyss. The city was silent, the buildings towering above him, casting long, ominous shadows that seemed to follow his every step. He felt exposed, vulnerable, as though the entire world were watching him, waiting for him to fall. He walked for hours, his mind numb, his thoughts fragmented. He wandered through empty streets, his footsteps the only sound, the shadows stretching and shifting as he moved. He felt like he was being watched, like something was lurking just out of sight, waiting for him to let his guard down. Finally, he found himself standing in front of an old, dilapidated building, a place he barely recognized, but felt a strange sense of familiarity. He hesitated, his instincts screaming at him to turn back, but something compelled him to step inside. The interior was dark and cold, the air thick with a musty, oppressive smell. The walls were lined with faded, peeling wallpaper, and the floor creaked beneath his feet as he moved deeper into the building. He felt a strange pull, a sensation that drew him forward, guiding him through the maze-like hallways, deeper into the darkness. As he walked, he saw flashes of memories, fragments of moments he had long forgotten, images of faces he barely recognized. He saw himself as a child, standing alone in a dark room, his eyes wide with fear as shadows moved around him, whispering his name. He saw himself as a teenager, lost and uncertain, haunted by doubts and insecurities that he could never quite escape. The memories were fleeting, slipping away as soon as he reached for them, leaving only a hollow emptiness in their wake. He felt as though he were peeling back the layers of his own mind, uncovering parts of himself that he had buried long ago. And then, he reached a door at the end of the hallway, a heavy wooden door, covered in strange dark stains that seemed to pulse with a life of their own. He felt a chill run down his spine as he placed his hand on the doorknob, a sense of foreboding settling over him. But he knew he had to go inside. He had to face whatever was waiting for him. He opened the door, stepping into a small, dimly lit room. The air was thick and suffocating, filled with the faint scent of decay. In the center of the room stood a large, ornate mirror, its surface covered in a layer of dust and grime. He felt drawn to it, compelled to look into the glass, to confront whatever lay within. He stepped forward, his heart pounding as he stared into the mirror. His reflection stared back at him, twisted and distorted, a dark, hollow version of himself, with eyes as black as the void. "Welcome home, Thomas," the reflection whispered, its voice soft, mocking. He felt a surge of anger, a spark of defiance that cut through the fear. "You're not me," he said, his voice trembling, but resolute. "You're nothing but a shadow." The reflection's mouth twisted into a cruel smile, its eyes glinting with malice. "Oh, but I am you, Thomas. I am every part of you that you tried to bury. Every dark thought, every fear, every doubt. I am the real you." He shook his head, his fists clenched at his sides. "No, I am more than that. I am not just my fears. I am not just my darkness." The reflection laughed, a hollow, chilling sound that echoed through the room. "You can lie to yourself all you want, Thomas, but deep down, you know the truth. You created me, you fed me, and now I am all that's left. Desperation clawed at him, and he took a step back, his mind racing. He couldn't let the shadow win. He couldn't let it take control. With a final surge of defiance, he grabbed the edges of the mirror, his hands pressing against the cold glass. I won't let you take me, he whispered, his voice filled with determination. I won't become you. The reflection's smile faded, replaced by a look of cold, calculating hatred. Then let's see who's stronger, Thomas. He felt a sharp, searing pain in his mind, as though something were being torn from him. His vision blurred, the room spinning around him as the shadow's presence filled his mind, drowning out his thoughts, his memories, his identity. But he fought back, clinging to his memories, his sense of self. He thought of his family, his friends, the life he had built. He forced himself to remember, to hold on to the fragments of himself that the shadow hadn't yet consumed. Chapter 8. A glimpse into the abyss. The pain was unbearable, an endless, searing agony that seemed to burn through every corner of Tom's mind, as though his very thoughts were being torn apart piece by piece. But amidst the agony, he clung to fragments of himself, memories that he held close, hoping they would be enough to keep him grounded, to keep him whole. The shadow fought back, its presence filling his mind with dark whispers, its voice twisting through his thoughts like a poison. It was relentless, flooding his consciousness with memories tainted by fear, images warped by doubt and regret. In every memory, every thought, the shadow had left its mark, twisting his life into something unrecognizable. Tom stumbled back, his hands still gripping the edges of the mirror, his vision blurring as the room spun around him. His reflection grinned at him from the glass, a cruel, mocking smile that stretched too wide, its eyes hollow and empty, dark voids that seemed to pull him in. You can't resist me, Thomas, the reflection whispered, its voice dripping with malice. I am your fears, your doubts, everything you tried to bury. You fed me, gave me life, and now I am stronger than you. The words echoed through his mind, a relentless chant that seemed to grow louder with every beat of his heart. He felt the shadow's influence creeping into his thoughts, its presence slipping into every corner of his mind, blotting out his memories, his sense of self. But even as he felt himself slipping, he clung to one last memory, a faint, fragile image that flickered in the darkness, a memory of his sister, her laughter filling the air, her hand reaching out to him, grounding him in a moment of pure, untainted happiness. He focused on that memory, forcing himself to hold on to it, to keep it alive in his mind. He could feel the shadow's presence recoiling, its grip loosening, as though it couldn't touch this memory, this part of him that was untouched by fear or doubt. The shadow's voice grew furious, a low, menacing hiss that reverberated through his thoughts. You think you can escape me with a memory, Thomas? I am in every part of you. There is nowhere to hide. But Tom refused to let go. He clung to the memory, letting it fill his mind, his heart, drowning out the darkness that threatened to consume him. He could feel his strength returning, a faint, fragile hope blossoming in the depths of his soul. And then, as he focused on the memory, he felt something shift, a subtle, almost imperceptible change in the air around him. The darkness seemed to waver, the shadows flickering as though something were pushing them back, forcing them to retreat. He opened his eyes, his vision clearing, and saw that the reflection in the mirror had changed. The twisted, hollow version of himself was gone, replaced by his own face, his own eyes, filled with a flicker of determination, of strength. For a moment, he felt a surge of relief, a sense of victory. He had faced the shadow, confronted the darkness within himself, and emerged victorious. But then, a cold, hollow laugh filled the room, a sound that sent a chill through his very soul. He turned, his heart pounding, and saw the shadow standing in the corner of the room, its form darker, more solid than ever before, its hollow eyes fixed on him, with a gaze that seemed to pierce through his very being. Did you really think it would be that easy, Thomas? The shadow taunted, its voice a low, mocking whisper. Did you think you could simply wish me away? The room grew colder, the air thickening, as though the very walls were closing in on him. He could feel the shadow's presence pressing down on him, a suffocating weight that filled every corner of his mind, his soul. He took a step back, his mind racing as the shadow advanced, its form shifting and twisting, its hollow eyes glinting with a malevolent light. "You are nothing without me," it hissed, its voice filled with a dark, insidious pleasure. "I am the only thing keeping you alive, keeping you whole. Without me, you are nothing but a shell, an empty vessel." Tom shook his head, his fists clenched at his sides. "No, you're wrong," he said, his voice trembling but defiant. "I don't need you. I never needed you." The shadow laughed, a cold, chilling sound that filled the room. "Then let's see how strong you really are." And with that, the shadow lunged at him, its form dissolving into a dark, swirling mist that enveloped him, filling his mind, his body, with a cold, consuming darkness. He could feel it slipping into his thoughts, his memories, twisting them, warping them, until he could no longer tell what was real and what was the shadow's doing. He fought back, struggling to hold on to his sense of self, his memories. But the darkness was relentless, overwhelming, drowning him in a sea of fear, of doubt, of despair. He could feel himself slipping, his mind fracturing as the shadow's influence grew stronger, consuming him from the inside out. He was losing himself, becoming nothing more than a vessel for the darkness, a hollow shell of the man he had once been. But even as he felt himself fading, a faint, distant voice echoed through his mind, a soft, gentle voice filled with warmth and love. It was his sister's voice, calling to him, grounding him, reminding him of who he was, of the life he had once lived. He clung to that voice, letting it fill his mind, his heart, drowning out the darkness that threatened to consume him. He could feel the shadow's grip loosening, its influence weakening as he focused on the memory of his sister, on the love they had shared. And then, with a final surge of strength, he forced the darkness back, pushing the shadow out of his mind, out of his soul. The shadow let out a furious scream, its form flickering, wavering, as though it were being torn apart. He opened his eyes, his vision clearing, and saw the shadow standing before him, its form weakened, its hollow eyes filled with rage, with desperation. "This isn't over, Thomas," it hissed, its voice a low, menacing whisper. "I am a part of you. You can't escape me." But Tom stood his ground, his gaze steady, his heart filled with a newfound strength. "You're wrong," he said, his voice firm, resolute. "You're nothing but a shadow, a part of me that I no longer need. And now, I'm letting you go." The shadow let out a final, furious scream, its form dissolving into a dark mist that filled the room, before slowly dissipating, fading into nothingness. And then, the room grew silent, the darkness lifting, leaving only a faint, lingering sense of peace. He stood there, breathing heavily, his heart pounding, as he felt the weight of the shadow's presence lift from his mind, his soul. He was free, truly free, from the darkness that had haunted him, consumed him, for so long. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, he felt a sense of peace, a sense of wholeness. He was no longer a prisoner of his own fears, his own doubts. He was free to live, to be himself, to embrace the light that had always been within him. He closed his eyes, a faint smile spreading across his face as he let the peace wash over him, filling him with a sense of hope, of joy that he had never known before. And as he opened his eyes, he knew, with a certainty that filled his heart, that he would never be alone again. Chapter 9. The Return of Darkness. Tom awoke to a strange silence. The air in his apartment was still and heavy, pressing down on him like a thick, invisible fog. The events of the previous night felt surreal, the memory of his confrontation with the shadow lingering in his mind like a bad dream. He had faced it, driven it back, and felt the sweet relief of freedom. But as he sat alone in the dim light of dawn, a gnawing dread settled in his chest, a faint whisper of doubt that he couldn't shake. He went about his morning routine with a sense of caution, as though afraid to disturb the silence. Every shadow seemed to stretch and twist. Every reflection felt as though it held a hidden menace just waiting to slip through. He tried to reassure himself, to remind himself that he was free, that he had won. But as the hours passed, the feeling grew stronger, the sense that something was watching him, waiting for him to falter. By the time night fell, his nerves were frayed. He sat alone in his living room, the dim glow of a single lamp casting long shadows across the walls. The silence pressed in on him, thick and oppressive, as though the darkness itself were alive, creeping closer with every heartbeat. He couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone, that the shadow hadn't truly left, that it was still lurking, just out of sight, biding its time. Then, as he sat there, the lamp flickered. The room darkened for a brief moment, the shadow stretching, swallowing the light. His heart pounded as the lamp flickered again, casting the room into darkness before flaring back to life. In that brief moment, he saw it. A figure standing in the corner of the room, watching him with hollow, empty eyes. He froze, his breath caught in his throat, his eyes locked on the figure. But as the light returned, it was gone, leaving only the faintest impression of darkness lingering in the corner. A shadow that seemed to pulse and shift as though it were alive. A cold dread washed over him, and he stumbled to his feet, his mind racing. No, he thought, his hands trembling. It's not real. It's just my imagination. But even as he tried to convince himself, he could feel the shadow's presence. A cold, dark energy that filled the room, pressing down on him, slipping into his thoughts, his mind. He felt as though he were being watched, as though the shadow were lurking just behind him, waiting for him to turn, to look, to acknowledge its presence. He backed away, his heart pounding, his hands clenched into fists. "You're not real," he whispered, his voice shaking. "I got rid of you. You're gone." But the shadows seemed to grow darker, thicker, filling the room with a suffocating weight. He could feel the darkness pressing against him, slipping into his mind, twisting his thoughts, his memories, until he could no longer tell what was real and what was the shadows doing. And then, in the silence, he heard it. A faint whisper, soft and sinister, echoing through the room like a cold breath. "Did you really think you could escape me, Thomas?" The voice was his own, distorted and twisted, filled with a dark, mocking amusement that sent a chill down his spine. He looked around, his eyes scanning the shadows, but he saw nothing, only the faintest flicker of movement at the edge of his vision. "I am a part of you," the voice continued, soft and insidious. "I am every fear, every doubt, every shadow you've ever tried to ignore. You can't escape me, Thomas. I am you." He stumbled back, his heart racing, his mind filled with a frantic, desperate need to escape, to get away from the darkness that filled every corner of the room. But no matter where he turned, he could feel the shadow's presence, slipping into his thoughts, his memories, his very soul. Desperation clawed at him, and he ran, his footsteps echoing through the apartment as he fled, his mind racing with fear, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't know where he was going, didn't care. All he knew was that he had to escape, to get away from the darkness that seemed to close in on him from every side. He reached the front door, his hands fumbling with the lock, his breaths coming in shallow, frantic gasps. He yanked the door open and stumbled into the hallway, the cool night air hitting him like a slap, grounding him, if only for a moment. But as he turned to flee, he felt a cold hand on his shoulder, a weight that made his skin crawl, filling him with a terror that he couldn't escape. He spun around, his heart pounding, his mind filled with a desperate, frantic need to escape. But there was nothing there. Only the empty hallway, the shadows stretching and twisting as though alive, as though they were watching him, waiting for him to let his guard down. He ran down the stairs, his footsteps echoing through the empty building, his mind racing with fear, his heart pounding in his chest. He could feel the darkness following him, pressing down on him, filling his mind with whispers that twisted his thoughts, his memories, until he could no longer tell what was real and what was the shadows doing. He stumbled out onto the street, the cool night air hitting him like a wave, grounding him, if only for a moment. He looked around, his eyes scanning the empty street, the darkened buildings. But he saw nothing, only the faintest flicker of movement in the shadows, a hint of darkness that seemed to pulse and shift, as though alive. He took a deep breath, his mind racing, his heart pounding, as he tried to calm himself, to shake off the feeling of being watched. But the shadows seemed to close in around him, pressing down on him, filling his mind with a cold, dark presence that felt as though it were slipping into his thoughts, his memories, his very soul. And then, in the silence, he heard it again, the faint, sinister whisper, echoing through the night like a cold breath. "You can't escape me, Thomas. I am in every shadow, every dark corner of your mind. I am a part of you, and I always will be." He stumbled back, his heart racing, his mind filled with a desperate, frantic need to escape, to get away from the darkness that filled every corner of his thoughts, his mind. But no matter where he turned, he could feel the shadow's presence, slipping into his memories, twisting his thoughts, until he could no longer tell what was real and what was the shadows doing. In a last, desperate attempt to regain control, he closed his eyes, forcing himself to breathe, to calm his racing heart. He focused on the memory of his sister, the sound of her laughter, the warmth of her hand in his, grounding himself in the faint, fragile hope that he could still hold on to the parts of himself that the shadow hadn't yet consumed. But even as he clung to that memory, he felt the shadow's influence creeping in, twisting the memory, warping it into something dark and distorted. He saw his sister's face, but her eyes were hollow, empty, filled with a darkness that mirrored his own. Her laughter turned into a low, mocking whisper, a voice that echoed through his mind, filling him with a cold, consuming dread. He opened his eyes, his heart pounding, his mind filled with a sense of hopelessness, a feeling that he was losing himself, that he was slipping further into the darkness with every passing moment. The shadow was winning, its presence growing stronger, more insistent, filling every corner of his mind, his soul. And as he stood there, alone in the cold night, he felt a chilling realization settle over him, a truth that he had tried to ignore but could no longer deny. The shadow wasn't just a part of him, it was him. Every thought, every memory, every part of his identity had been consumed, twisted, until he was nothing more than a vessel, a shell for the darkness that had always been there, lurking in the corners of his mind. He had lost. The shadow had won. Chapter 10. Into the Shadow. Tom's realization washed over him, cold and unrelenting. He was no longer himself. The shadow, the darkness he had tried so desperately to fight, had finally claimed him. It was inside him, coiled around his very soul, leaving nothing but a hollow shell of the man he once was. The street was empty, silent, and the shadows seemed to breathe, to pulse with a life of their own. Each shadow held his reflection, but not the man he recognized. His face was a mask, twisted with a sinister, mocking smile, his eyes hollow, dark voids that seemed to pull everything around him into their emptiness. This was who he was now, a vessel of darkness, a twisted reflection of the person he had tried so hard to protect. "You thought you could resist me," the shadow's voice whispered in his mind, cold and mocking, "but you are nothing without me. I am the truth that you've hidden, the part of yourself you never wanted to face." Tom stumbled back, his heart pounding as he turned, hoping to flee, to escape. But as he took his first step, he felt an intense pull from within, as though something had wrapped around his heart, his mind, dragging him back. His legs moved without his will, his body no longer his own. The darkness was pulling him in, claiming every part of him, until he could no longer tell where he ended and the shadow began. The street twisted around him, reality blurring, shifting as the shadows closed in. He could hear whispers, faint and sinister, voices that echoed through his mind, filling every corner of his thoughts with a dark, malevolent presence. Each step took him deeper into the abyss, a place where light could not reach, where he could no longer cling to the memories that had once kept him grounded. The darkness had swallowed him whole. Some time passed in a blur. He couldn't tell how long he had been walking, drifting through an endless sea of shadows. Every step felt like he was sinking deeper, the air thick and suffocating, filling his lungs with a cold, empty ache that gnawed at his insides. He felt himself slipping away, his thoughts, his memories, unraveling into the darkness, leaving only fragments, pieces that no longer fit together. At some point he found himself back in his apartment, though he couldn't remember how he had gotten there. The rooms were dark, the shadows dense and heavy, filling every corner with a presence that felt alive. watching him, waiting. He could feel it pressing down on him, slipping into his thoughts, his soul, erasing the last remnants of the person he had once been. He wandered through the apartment like a ghost, his footsteps silent, his mind numb. The walls felt as though they were closing in, the air thick and oppressive, each shadow a reminder of the darkness that now claimed him. He was alone, utterly and completely, with nothing but the whispers in his mind, the faint echoes of a voice that sounded like his own, yet twisted, distorted, filled with malice. He found himself in front of the mirror in his bedroom, staring at his own reflection, or rather, the twisted, hollow version of himself that the shadow had become. His face was pale, his eyes dark and empty, filled with a cold, calculating darkness that sent a chill through him. He barely recognized himself, the person he had once been, lost beneath layers of fear, doubt, and darkness. "This is who you are now, Thomas," the shadow whispered, its voice a low, insidious hiss. "You are nothing but a vessel, a shell. You belong to me." He felt a surge of despair, a hopelessness that settled over him like a shroud. He was lost, trapped in a darkness he could never escape, a prisoner of his own mind. The life he had once known, the memories he had cherished, were nothing more than fading echoes, fragments that had been swallowed by the shadow's insatiable hunger. He tried to look away, to tear his gaze from the reflection, but he couldn't. The shadow held him captive, its hollow eyes boring into his soul, filling him with a darkness that felt endless, eternal. "You thought you could resist me," the shadow continued, its voice a mocking whisper. "But you were always mine. From the moment you let me in, I have been growing, feeding, waiting. And now, there is nothing left of you, Thomas. You are nothing but a shadow." He closed his eyes, his mind filled with a desperate, frantic need to escape, to find some way to reclaim himself. But even as he clung to that hope, he felt it slipping away, the darkness seeping into his thoughts, his memories, erasing everything that made him who he was. And then, in that final moment of surrender, he felt something else, a faint, fragile glimmer of light, a memory that had somehow survived the darkness, a fragment of the person he had once been. It was a memory of his sister, her laughter filling the air, her hand reaching out to him, grounding him in a moment of pure, untainted happiness. He could feel her presence, a warmth that cut through the cold, a light that pushed back the darkness, if only for a moment. He clung to that memory, letting it fill his mind, his heart, drowning out the shadow's whispers, the darkness that threatened to consume him. He could feel his strength returning, a faint, fragile hope that blossomed in the depths of his soul. The shadow's grip on his mind loosened, its influence weakening, as he focused on that memory, on the love he had shared, on the person he had once been. The reflection in the mirror faltered, its hollow eyes narrowing as though it sensed his defiance, his determination. The shadow's voice grew furious, a low, menacing hiss that reverberated through his mind. "You think a memory can save you?" It spat, its voice filled with rage. "You are mine. You belong to me." But Tom stood his ground, his gaze steady, his heart filled with a newfound strength. He focused on the memory, on the warmth, the light, letting it fill every corner of his mind, pushing back the darkness, reclaiming the parts of himself that the shadow had tried to erase. And then, with a final, desperate surge of strength, he forced the shadow out of his mind, out of his soul. The darkness recoiled, its form flickering, wavering, as though it were being torn apart. The reflection in the mirror twisted, contorted, the shadow's face filling with fury, desperation, as it fought to maintain its hold, its grip on his mind. But Tom was relentless, his resolve unbreakable, his determination stronger than the shadow's darkness. And in that moment, he felt the shadow's presence weaken, its influence fading, as though it were being drawn back, pulled into the depths from which it had come. The shadow let out a final furious scream, its form dissolving into a dark mist that filled the room, before slowly dissipating, fading into nothingness. The room grew silent, the darkness lifting, leaving only a faint, lingering sense of peace. Tom stood there, breathing heavily, his heart pounding, as he felt the weight of the shadow's presence lift from his mind, his soul. He was free, truly free, from the darkness that had haunted him, consumed him for so long. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, he felt a sense of peace, a sense of wholeness. He was no longer a prisoner of his own fears, his own doubts. He was free to live, to be himself, to embrace the light that had always been within him. He closed his eyes, a faint smile spreading across his face as he let the peace wash over him, filling him with a sense of hope, of joy that he had never known before. And as he opened his eyes, he knew, with a certainty that filled his heart, that he would never be alone again.